It's the classic tale of ambition clashing with small-town charm. But what if there's a twist that turns this familiar narrative into something far more gripping? What if the person who could derail his plans isn't an angry mob of residents or a rival investor? What if it's the one person he never expected, the teacher who once rejected his high school confession, the woman who saw through his facade of confidence to the vulnerable boy beneath? This isn't just about land deals and broken hearts. It's about the secrets that small towns keep buried, the identities we hide even from ourselves, and the past that has a way of catching up no matter how far we run. It's about the moment when the past collides with the present, with a force that can either destroy everything in its path or offer a second chance at redemption. Are you ready to discover what happens when a billionaire's carefully constructed world is turned upside down by the one person who never believed he was meant to leave? What if this encounter forces him to choose between the empire he's built and the heart he left behind? And what if the real treasure wasn't in the land he sought to buy, but in the memories he'd tried to forget? Matthew Stewart had always been a man of grand plans and even grander executions. But as his private jet descended toward the quaint runway of Willow Creek, the town he'd abandoned 2 decades prior, even he felt a twinge of doubt. "Just another business trip," he muttered, though the words felt hollow even to his own ears. The truth was, this trip hit different. He'd adopted the alias Jonathan Reed, a simple consultant, to mask his true intentions. The local folks deserved better than the shock of learning a billionaire was slick talking them out of their land, or so he told himself. The landscape below stirred memories he'd long buried. The old oak tree where he'd carved his initials next to Emily Lopez. The creek where they'd skipped stones, laughing until their sides ached. But that was then. This was now. He had a mission: acquire the 200 acres bordering the school's nature preserve, the perfect piece of the puzzle for his mega resort development. As the plane touched down, Matthew adjusted his nondescript glasses and tugged at his polo shirt far cry from his usual Armani suits. Small-town secrets had always fascinated him, even as a kid, how the same dirt roads could hide so many stories. He just hoped his wasn't about to become the next one. The innkeeper, a jolly woman with a name tag reading Doris, eyed him suspiciously as he checked in. "Ain't seen you around these parts," she said, her voice a mix of southern drawl and barely veiled skepticism. Matthew forced a smile. "Just passing." "Through," he lied, hating how the words left a bitter taste. But this was necessary, for the greater good. Or was it? The line between nature versus profit had always been blurry to him, until now. As he drove through the familiar streets, the weight of his deception pressed down. The town hadn't changed much. Same white picket fences, same red barns, same sense of community that had once made him feel invincible. But he wasn't that kid anymore, was he? At the local diner, he overheard snippets of conversation. "They say a developer's sniffing around," one man said, his voice low. "Probably some city slicker who don't know the first thing about our ways." Matthew's heart raced. He was that city slicker. But he wasn't just any city slicker. He was a billionaire in disguise with a mission. As he sipped his coffee, trying to blend in despite his expensive watch peeking out from his sleeve, he spotted the notice board, a flyer for the teacher's stand. Meeting caught his eye. Emily. Lopez's name was scribbled at the bottom. His hands shook. Emily. The name alone brought back a flood of memories. The way she'd laughed at his clumsy attempts at poetry, how she'd gently rejected his high school confession, saying, "You're too big for this town, Matthew. Don't make me the reason you stay." He'd left the next day, vowing never to return. Until now. The next morning, he stood at the edge of the nature preserve, the land he aimed to buy stretching out before him. A group of kids from the local school skipped by, their teacher a woman with long dark hair and a familiar smile guiding them. Emily. She hadn't changed much. still the same fiery spirit that had once made his teenage heart race. As she turned, their eyes met. For a moment time stopped, then she frowned, confusion flickering across her face. Matthew's breath hitched. Had she recognized him? The possibility sent a jolt through him. This was just the beginning of his high school crush, twist a plot he hadn't seen coming. And as he watched Emily lead the children in a game, her laughter mingling with theirs, he felt the first crack in his carefully constructed facade. What had started as a simple land deal was about to become something much more complicated, something that might just change everything. Matthew's fingers drummed against the steering wheel as he parked his rental car in front of the old general store, now barely holding itself together with rusty nails and faded paint. The development project he had in mind wasn't just any project, it was a behemoth of modern luxury, a five-star resort with sparkling pools, high-end spas, and conference centers. That would put Willow Creek on the map. This town needs a shot in the arm, he muttered, though the words felt like a slap to the memories still clinging to him. The resort would bring jobs. Sure, good-paying ones that didn't involve milking cows or teaching kindergartners how to tie their shoes. But as he stepped out into the crisp morning air, the scent of pine and freshly turned earth hitting him like a wave, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was playing with fire, had spent weeks researching, crunching numbers until his eyes bled. The from rejection to redemption angle had been his secret motivator all along. Willow Creek had spit him out like a bad apple years ago when his family's farm failed, and now he was back with a vengeance, or so he told himself. The truth was messier. The truth was that every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emily's face the way she'd looked at him that day in the schoolyard, her brow furrowed as she handed back his crumpled poem. "You deserve better than this town," she'd said, her voice soft but firm. Now he was here to prove her wrong, or maybe to prove himself right. Either way, the line was blurry. At the town's ramshackle planning office, he laid out his blueprints on a scarred wooden table. The designs were flawless, sleek lines, sustainable materials, even a nod to the town's rustic charm with reclaimed wood accents. But as he explained his vision to the sleepy-eyed council members, he caught sight of his reflection in a cracked window pane. Who was he kidding? This wasn't just about business. This was about rewriting history, about turning the town that had once made him feel small into something grand, something that screamed, "See, I mattered." But as he packed up his things after the meeting, a flyer tucked under a stack of unpaid bills caught his eye. "Save our nature, preserve it," read Emily's name scrawled at the bottom. His stomach lurched. The preserve was right in the crosshairs of his development, and so was she. Later that night, he sat in his rented cabin, the flickering light of his laptop screen casting shadows on the walls. News articles about other towns that had sold out to corporate giants scrolled past, headlines about lost community, about elderly residents forced out, about the billionaire with a heart who had promised the moon and delivered a black hole. Matthew's jaw tightened. He wasn't like those guys. His project would be different. It would honor the land while modernizing it. But as he stared at a photo of the nature preserve, its lush greenery, the creek winding like a silver ribbon, he wondered if he was kidding himself. The nature versus profit debate had always been a zero-sum game, and he was about to find out which side he was really on. The next morning, he woke to a knock at the door. Before he could answer, Emily stood there, her arms crossed, her eyes sharp as the knives in his father's old shed. "You're planning to destroy the preserve," she said. "No hello, no pleasantries, just accusation." Matthew's mind raced. How did she know? Had someone talked? Or was it that intuitive spark she'd always had, the one that had seen right through his teenage bluster? "It's not like that," he began, but she cut him off with a laugh that wasn't funny. "Save it for someone who believes. In fairy tales, Jonathan, The use of his alias stung more than he expected. As she turned to leave, he called out, "It's Matthew, my name is Matthew." She paused, but didn't turn around. And just like that, the dance began. The fluorescent lights of the community center buzzed overhead as Matthew took his seat in the back row, his fingers tapping nervously against his notebook. The town hall surprise had been called to discuss potential land sales, and he'd come prepared with smooth talking points and rehearsed smiles. But nothing could have prepared him for the moment. The door swung open and Emily Lopez strode in, her presence lighting up the room like a wildfire. Time froze. For a heartbeat, their eyes met a flash of recognition, then confusion. "Matthew?" she breathed, her voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd like a knife. The room erupted into a hum of whispers as heads turned. "It's you," she said, her tone a mix of disbelief and something sharper, something that made his stomach drop. Anger, betrayal, he couldn't tell. But as she approached, her heels clicking against the linoleum, he realized the game had just changed. "Fancy seeing you here," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Or should I call you Jonathan?" The room stilled. Matthew's mind raced. How had she known? Had someone talked? Or had she always seen through his disguise? "Emily," he started, but she held up a hand. "Save it. The kids and I have been researching. Funny how small towns talk, even after all these years." Her words were a punch to the gut. The small-town secrets he'd once found charming now felt like a noose. As the meeting descended into chaos, with townsfolk demanding answers, Matthew spotted a flicker of something in Emily's eyes, not just anger, but a spark of the girl who'd once made him believe in impossible things. And as she turned away, her voice carrying over the uproar, "We don't sell our souls for profit here." He wondered if this was the hidden identity reveal he'd been running from, or the very thing he'd needed all along. Emily's classroom was a riot of color and chaos, exactly how she liked it. Construction paper butterflies fluttered from the ceiling, and the smell of glue and apple juice hung in the air. "All right, little explorers," she called, her voice warm as she gathered her students for story time. "Today we're going to learn about why our nature preserve is so special." The kids leaned in, their eyes wide with curiosity. This was her world now, a far cry from the halls of Willow Creek High, where she'd once been Matthew Stewart's secret crush. Back then, she'd been too shy to do much more than steal glances at him during chemistry class, her heart skipping every time he laughed. Now, her heart skipped for different reasons, like the way it had flipped when she'd seen him at the town meeting, looking all grown up in his button-down shirt and expensive cologne. But this wasn't high school anymore. She had bigger fish to fry, like protecting the nature preserve that her students adored. After class, she stayed late, pinning up drawings of local wildlife to the bulletin board. The knock at her door made her jump. "Busy?" Matthew's voice was smooth, but his eyes darted around the room like he was searching for an escape route. Emily straightened. "What do you want, Matthew?" She didn't bother with pleasantries. He shuffled his feet, a gesture so familiar. It brought back memories of him nervously reciting that awful poem in the schoolyard. "I wanted to talk about the development," he said, his tone carefully neutral. Emily's laugh was short and sharp. "Oh, you mean the one that's going to bulldoze our nature preserve?" She crossed her arms, her teacher instincts kicking in not just for her students, but for the town she loved. "You think I don't know what you're doing?" she challenged, her voice rising with controlled passion. "You're not just buying land, you're buying your way into our memories, into the places that matter." Matthew's expression hardened, a mask of corporate resolve falling over his features. "It's progress, Emily, something this town needs." But she could see the flicker of doubt behind his confident facade, the same doubt she'd once seen when he'd asked, her to the Sadie Hawkins dance, and she'd said no, believing he was destined for a world far beyond Willow Creek. Back then, she'd thought she was letting him go, setting him free. Now she realized she might have been pushing him away from the very thing he needed, the roots he was now trying to sever. As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the room, Emily gestured to the vibrant drawings on the wall. "These kids," she said softly, her voice losing some of its edge. "They spend hours here learning about the creek, the animals, the plants. It's not just a piece of land to them, it's magic." Matthew's gaze followed hers, landing on a crayon-scribbled picture of a deer titled Benny's Favorite Animal. For a fleeting moment, the tension in the room shifted, becoming something more complex than a simple standoff. "I get that," he said, his voice unexpectedly gentle, almost a whisper. "I really do." But before Emily could respond, the sharp ring of the school bell signaled the end of the day. As the first wave of children burst in, chattering excitedly about their weekends, Matthew stepped back, retreating from the warmth and chaos. "We're not done," she said, more to his retreating back than to his face. As the door closed behind him, she wondered if this tense, complicated dance was the second-chance romance she'd always secretly hoped for, or just another chapter in the from rejection to redemption story she'd been living since graduation. Later that evening, Emily sat at her kitchen table, the low hum of the refrigerator the only sound as she pored over the blueprints Matthew had accidentally left behind during their heated discussion. The plans were impressive sleek lines, modern amenities, grand promises of economic revival. But as she traced the cold architectural outlines of what would become a massive resort, her finger landed on the exact spot where the nature preserve stood. A knot formed in her throat. "No," she whispered to the empty room. This wasn't just about saving a piece of land, it was about preserving the very soul of Willow Creek, the same soul that had shaped her and Matthew in ways they were only now beginning to understand. She thought of her students' innocent drawings, their unwavering belief in the magic of nature. And she thought of Matthew, the boy who'd once tried to win her heart with bad poetry, now trying to win over a town with money and power. Maybe she mused, a flicker of hope igniting within her. There was a way to honor both dreams. But first, she needed to find a way to make him see what she saw, a town worth fighting for, not just buying. Matthew's footsteps echoed through the empty school hallway as he made his way to the rooftop garden, a hidden gem he'd discovered during his first day back. The air up here was clearer, the town's secrets laid bare beneath a canopy of stars. He leaned against the railing, the cool metal an anchor against the storm of memories threatening to overwhelm him. Emily's words from earlier that day still lingered. "You think you can just waltz back in and buy our memories?" Each syllable a stone, skipping across the fragile pond of his composure, but it was the look in her eyes that had truly undone him. That same mix of compassion and fierce resolve he remembered from senior year, when he'd cornered her after chemistry class, his palms slick with sweat and his heart pounding like a war drum. "I've liked you for a long time," he'd blurted out, the carefully crafted poem he'd spent weeks perfecting completely forgotten in the heat of the moment. Emily had smiled then, a gentle, sad thing that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're sweet, Matthew," she'd said, her voice like a soothing balm to a wounded animal, "but you deserve someone who can keep up with you, someone who isn't tethered to this town." The rejection had been kind, meant to spare his feelings, but it had cut deeper than any knife. It was the catalyst for his departure, for the ensuing years spent building walls as tall and impenetrable as his skyscrapers. And now, here he was, those very walls crumbling at the sight of her standing in front of a classroom full of kids who adored her, who saw in her the same undeniable light he'd once chased so desperately. The next morning, driven by an impulse he didn't fully understand, he found himself outside her classroom again. He didn't linger in the shadows this time. "Can I help with the nature preserve cleanup?" he asked, his voice steady despite the chaos. Of children scrambling for gloves and trash bags. Emily's brow furrowed in suspicion, but she didn't refuse him. As they worked side by side, the rhythmic crunch of twigs beneath their feet the only sound between them, Matthew spotted a small, smooth stone in the shape of a heart. He picked it up and handed it to her without a word. She turned it over in her palm, her touch as feather-light as he remembered. "Remember the creek?" he asked, the words feeling heavy in the air. They'd spent countless afternoons there, skipping stones and dreaming of futures they couldn't yet see. Emily's laugh was soft, a ghost of a sound. "You used to say, the water held magic." Matthew's chest tightened. Maybe it still does. The moment hung between them, as fragile and shimmering as a soap bubble, before the shouts of the children erupted, breaking the spell. That evening, over a dinner of takeout Chinese, her favorite, a detail he recalled with a small, private flicker of triumph, Emily spoke of the past in a way that made Matthew's heart ache, with a strange mix of regret and hope. "I wasn't ready then," she said, her chopsticks pausing mid-air as she looked at him directly. "I was scared of how much I cared for you, scared of what it would mean if I let myself fall." Matthew's fork clattered against his plate, the sound jarring in the quiet kitchen. "And now?" he asked, the question escaping before he could stop it, unsure if he truly wanted to hear the answer. Emily's gaze dropped to her lap, her vulnerability a stark contrast to the fierce activist he'd been facing. "Now," she said softly, "I wonder what might have been." The words hung in the space between them, a bridge to a past they had never traveled. As the quiet stretched, Matthew realized this was the old feelings return moment he'd been simultaneously dreading and secretly craving. These were the same feelings that had driven him to build an empire, to prove to the world and to himself that he was more than the boy who'd been left behind. Just then, Emily's cat, a fluffy creature named Mr. Whiskers, sauntered into the room, demanding attention, and the intense moment dissolved, leaving Matthew with a question that burned brighter than any boardroom presentation. What if this time things could be different? Matthew awoke the next morning to the sound of birds chirping outside his cabin window, the gentle rhythm a stark contrast to the blaring alarms and traffic noise of his city penthouse. As he brewed a pot of coffee black, no sugar, just as he'd always taken it back in high school, his thoughts drifted to Emily and her unwavering, almost fierce dedication to Willow Creek. It was embarrassing, really, how a simple act of picking up trash at the nature preserve had left him more unsettled than any high-stakes boardroom confrontation. But there it was, a flicker of curiosity, stubborn as a weed, taking root in the barren soil of his carefully constructed indifference. He remembered with vivid clarity how she'd knelt beside that wounded blue jay last week, her brow furrowed with a profound concern as she'd carefully wrapped its broken wing in a small piece of cloth. "You'd think she was saving the whole world," he muttered to himself, though a warmth spreading through his chest suggested he already knew the truth. For her, in that moment, she was. This was more than just a small-town secret's fascination. This was the slow, unnerving burn of recognition, of seeing in Emily's passion a faint reflection of the boy he'd once been, the one who'd believed in magic creeks and the possibility of forever loves. At the local cafe, which had become an unwilling observation post, he found her sitting with a group of parents and students. Their table was a chaotic sea of petitions, highlighters, and maps of the preserve. "We need more signatures to stop the development," she was saying, her voice animated and convincing as she gestured toward a specific area on the map. "This is where the oldest birch trees are." Matthew hovered at the edge of the group, his paper, cup of coffee cradled like a shield. He'd always prided himself on his ability to read people, to understand their fears, their desires, the hidden levers that made them tick. It was the key to his success. But Emily was different. She wore her heart like a badge of honor, her motivations as clear and transparent as the creek water they'd once skipped stones in. And that transparency, that unapologetic, fierce care for a town that had once spit him out like a bad apple, was doing funny things to his carefully guarded plans. As she laughed at something, one of the kids said, "A bright-eyed girl with streaks of paint on her cheeks." Matthew felt the first genuine stirrings of what could only be called intrigue. It wasn't the calculated strategic interest he'd felt in business, deals or high society galas. This was messier, more unpredictable. And as she caught his eye across the room and winked just a quick, playful flash before turning back to her group, he wondered if this might be the billionaire with a heart story he'd always rejected, knocking at his door, whether he liked it or not. Later that afternoon, he found himself drawn back to the edge of the nature preserve, the land he'd planned to bulldoze, now viewed through a completely different lens. The world of charity gala circuits and luxury real estate deals suddenly felt distant, their allure dimmed by the simple, profound sight of Emily leading a group of kids on a nature walk. She pointed to a cluster of wildflowers, her face alight with a pure, unadulterated passion as she explained their significance to the local ecosystem, how they supported the bee population. Matthew's fingers brushed against the smooth, heart-shaped stone in his pocket, the one he'd given her a lifetime ago. Back then, he'd seen this town as nothing more than a stepping stone, a place to prove himself before moving on to bigger, better, things. But watching Emily now, her enthusiasm as infectious as the common cold as she taught the children to respect the land, he began to see it differently, not as a resource to be exploited, but as a living entity worth protecting. The shift was subtle, like the first light of dawn creeping over the horizon, but it was undeniably there. As the kids scampered ahead, their laughter echoing through the trees, Emily glanced back and smiled a small, knowing gesture that sent an unexpected jolt through him. It occurred to him then that maybe he hadn't come back to Willow Creek just to buy land. Maybe, just maybe, he'd come back to remember why he'd left in the first place. That evening, over a dinner of reheated takeout, Emily had insisted on sharing her infamous teacher survival meal of microwave pasta and veggie sticks. They talked of things trivial and profound. She spoke of her students' latest art project, a sprawling mural depicting the town's history, their tiny hands working diligently to capture its essence. He spoke of his travels, of gleaming cities that glittered with promise, but never truly satisfied the gnawing emptiness inside. And in the quiet spaces between their words, the unspoken grew. The way her eyes lit up when she talked about the preserve, the way his chest tightened when she laughed, that same melodic sound he'd once memorized in the back of chemistry class. It was in one of these comfortable pauses that Matthew finally grasped the true power of her passion. It wasn't just about saving acres of trees. It was about preserving a way of life, about honoring the community over commerce values that had once been his own before the world taught him otherwise. As she reached across the small table to grab a napkin, her sleeve slid up to reveal a fading silvery scar on her forearm from a childhood phallus scar he remembered bandaging himself after. They'd slipped on a patch of ice by the creek. The memory was so sharp, so sudden, that he felt the formidable walls he'd built over years of rejection and hurt begin to crack, just a little. But it was enough to let the light in. As they sat on her creaking porch steps, watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible hues of orange and pink, the day's events settling around them like a comfortable blanket, Matthew finally voiced the question that had been nagging at him. "You know," he said, tossing the heart-shaped stone into the air and catching it, a nervous habit he hadn't realized he still possessed, "I never understood why you stayed here." With all your talent, your passion, you could have been anywhere. Emily's gaze followed the stone's gentle arc, her expression thoughtful. "This is where I belong," she said, her voice simple but firm. "These kids, this town, they need someone to fight for them, someone who remembers what it's like to believe in magic." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Matthew thought of his own childhood dreams, of the terrible poems he'd written and the silent promises he'd made to a girl who'd never truly seen the man he would become. And in that moment, as the first stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky and the evening breeze carried the clean scent of pine, he finally understood. This wasn't just about land deals or rekindled crushes. This was about finding the part of himself he'd abandoned in Willow Creek all those years ago. As Emily turned to him, her eyes reflecting the fading light, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he could be the one to help her protect it. After all, old feelings had a way of returning, often when you least expected them, and with an intensity that could change everything. Emily stood at the front of her classroom, her fingers brushing against the edge of the whiteboard, where she'd scrawled, "Save our preserve," in bold, determined letters. The room was packed, not just with her kindergarten kids, whose faces were smudged with paint from their latest art project, but with parents, grandparents, and even a few skeptical townsfolk who'd wandered in out of sheer curiosity. "This land isn't just dirt and trees," she began, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. "It's where Tommy learned to identify bird songs, where Maria found her first butterfly chrysalis. It's where we all remember what it feels like to be connected to something bigger than ourselves." She paused, letting the weight of their shared memories settle over the room like dew on morning grass. From the corner of her eye, she spotted Matthew lingering in the doorway, his expression unreadable beneath his usual mask of polite, corporate detachment. But she didn't falter. This was her ground. "We're not asking for much," she continued, her gaze sweeping across the familiar faces. "Just a chance to protect what matters before it's too late." After the meeting, Emily found herself outside, the evening air turning crisp and nipping at her cheeks as she locked up the school. The nature preserve stretched out before her, a dark, breathing blanket of trees and shadows under the nascent stars. She had spent countless hours here as a child, exploring its hidden paths with Matthew, dreaming of adventures far beyond Willow Creek. Now, those same paths felt like a call to arms. Pulling her phone from her pocket, her fingers moved quickly. As she typed out a message to the parents' group, "Need volunteers for cleanup day at the preservelets. Show the town how much this place means to us." Within minutes, replies flooded her screen, thumbs-up emojis, promises of baked goods, and even an offer of a truck from the owner of the local hardware store. As she scrolled through the messages, a surge of defiant hope warming her. A familiar voice made her jump. "You're really putting yourself out there, aren't you?" Matthew stood a few feet away, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets, looking more like an intruder than the boy who once knew these grounds as well as she did. Emily's heart gave a little leap, a traitorous reaction she was growing increasingly tired of. "Someone has to," she said, her tone lighter than she felt. "You planning to stop me?" He shrugged, a non-committal gesture, but the glint in his eye told her he was anything but indifferent. "Wouldn't dream of it," he said, a smirk playing on his lips that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just here to see what all the fuss is about." As he turned to leave, his silhouette disappearing into the growing darkness, Emily called after him, "You should come help. Might surprise you how rewarding it is." She didn't miss the way his pace slowed, just for a fraction of a second before he rounded the corner. The next morning, Emily arrived at the preserve to find it already buzzing with an energy the town hadn't seen in years. Townsfolk of all ages wielded rakes and trash bags with the enthusiasm of warriors defending their kingdom. Even old Mr. Henderson, whose grumpy exterior was as legendary as his wife's apple pie, was there, meticulously collecting discarded cans with a pair of long-handled tongs. "Never thought I'd see the day," he muttered, as Emily approached, a rare, crackly smile tugging at his lips. "But your little crusades got everyone stirred up." Emily's heart swelled with pride. This was community, not just in times of crisis, but when someone gave them a reason to care. As she worked her way through the underbrush, she spotted a figure near the creek that made her pause. It was Matthew, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows and his expensive watch tucked safely into his pocket. He was talking to a group of kids from her class, his hands moving with animation as he explained how the complex root systems of the trees help prevent soil erosion. The sight was so jarringly unexpected, it almost took her breath away. This wasn't the man who'd swept into town with grand plans and a pocket full of cash. This was someone else, someone who remembered the names of local fish species and how to build a proper dam with nothing but sticks and mud. As she watched, one of the kids, a boy named Leo, shouted, "Mr. Matthew, look what I found!" and held up a shimmering flat stone. Matthew's laughter rang out, clear and entirely unguarded, and for a moment Emily saw a flicker of the boy he'd once been, the one who'd believed in magic creeks and whispered forever promises under that old oak tree. Later, as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in audacious strokes of gold and pink, Emily found Matthew alone by that very tree, where their initials, now faded and barely visible, were carved into the bark. He was tracing the letters. With a single finger, his expression lost in thought. "I didn't think you'd come," she said, her voice gentle so as not to startle him. He turned, surprise flickering across his face before he schooled it back into a mask of neutrality. "Why wouldn't I?" he countered, but the question hung between them, a bridge to a conversation they'd avoided for 20 years. Emily stepped closer, the crunch of dried leaves beneath her boots the only sound in the quiet air. "Because it's easier to destroy than to protect," she said softly. "But not everyone chooses easy." Matthew's gaze dropped to the ground, his jaw tightening. "You think I don't know that?" he murmured, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely showed. "You think I haven't spent years trying to outrun the parts of myself that wanted to stay?" The raw, unvarnished honesty in his words startled her. It was the closest he'd come to admitting any vulnerability since his return, and it felt like a key turning in a lock she hadn't even known was there. Before she could find the words to respond, the distant honk of a car horn shattered the moment. A parent was waving from the parking lot, a reminder that the real world and the fight ahead was waiting. "We're not done here," she said, her tone light but firm. Matthew's smile was wry, tired but genuine. Wouldn't expect anything less. As she walked away, the weight of their shared history settled around them like the evening mist, promise unspoken, a battle just begun. That night, Emily sat at her desk, drafting a press release for the preservation movement. Her phone pinged. It was a message from Matthew. "Found this in my pocket after today," he wrote, attaching a photo of the heart-shaped stone shed given him. "In high school, still got its magic, I guess." Emily's fingers hovered over the keyboard, the line between past and present having never felt thinner. She typed slowly, each word a careful step across uncertain ground. "Magic's wherever you choose to see it," she replied. Almost instantly, a new message came through. "Meet me at the diner tomorrow. We need to talk." Emily's breath caught. This felt different. This was a crack in his armor, a chance to rewrite their story. But as she closed her laptop, the weight of what lay ahead pressed down. This wasn't just about saving a nature preserve anymore. It was about deciding if some things and some people were worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. As the first stars began to twinkle outside her window, Emily allowed herself a small, hopeful smile. After all, old feelings had a way of returning, often when you least expected them. Matthew stood at the front of the town hall, his fingers tightening around the edges of his presentation remote until his knuckles were white. The room was packed, the air thick with anticipation and more than a little hostility. Emily sat in the front row, her posture rigid, her expression a carefully constructed mask of neutrality, though he could see the slight tremor in her clasped hands. He'd rehearsed his pitch 100 times in sterile hotel rooms and silent boardrooms, but nothing could have prepared him for the visceral weight of those familiar faces staring back at him, Mr. Henderson with his arms crossed like a fortress, Mrs. O'Malley clutching her purse as if it were a weapon, and Emily, whose gaze felt like a physical spotlight boring into his very soul. "This development isn't just about progress," he began, his voice surprisingly steady despite the churn of emotions in his gut. "It's about opportunity, good-paying jobs, modern amenities, a future for the younger generation that doesn't involve leaving town to find work." The words tasted like ash on his tongue, not because he didn't believe them on some level, but because they felt like a profound betrayal of the boy he'd once been, the one who dreamed of escaping Willow Creek, only to discover that the glittering world beyond lacked the fundamental heart of his forsaken hometown. As he clicked through slides showcasing sleek resort designs and impressive, sterile economic projections, he caught snippets of muttering from the crowd. "More like a land grab," someone whispered loudly, the words slicing through the tense air. Emily's eyes narrowed, a silent storm brewing behind her carefully maintained composure. Matthew pressed on, his voice becoming more strained as he highlighted the project's sustainable features, the planned community spaces, the educational programs for local schools. "This isn't about tearing down what you love," he insisted, though the lie sat heavy and cold in his throat. "It's about building something new that honors the old." But he could see it in their faces, in the way they shifted restlessly in their hard wooden seats, the way Emily's knuckles whitened around her pent as they weren't buying it, not anymore. After the meeting adjourned in a chaotic blend of scattered applause and resounding boos, Matthew found Emily waiting for him outside, the sharp evening light casting her features in stark relief. "You really believe that stuff, don't you?" she asked, her voice tinged with an emotion that sounded suspiciously like disappointment, which hurt more than anger ever could. Matthew's jaw tightened. "It's not about me believing it," he said. The words, a flimsy shield against the vulnerability he refused to acknowledge. "It's about giving this town a future." Emily stepped closer, her presence filling his senses in a way that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the undeniable pull of their shared history. "Our future isn't for sale, Matthew," she said softly, her words a quiet punch to the gut. "Not even for all the jobs in the world." Before he could formulate a response, she turned and walked away, the click of her heels on the pavement a sound of retreat that left him more unsettled than any boardroom defeat. The next morning, Matthew found himself at the edge of the nature preserve again. The land he'd planned to transform now seemed to mock him through a different lens. He'd always been a master at seeing potential, the hidden value in a piece of land, the untapped profit in a struggling market. But as he watched Emily lead a group of kids in planting saplings, their tiny hands working with diligent purpose under her gentle guidance, he realized he'd missed something crucial. This land wasn't just potential, it was purpose. It was the reason those kids' eyes lit up when they discovered a nest of frogs' eggs in the creek. It was the way Mr. Henderson's gruff exterior visibly softened when he spoke about the blue jays that nested in the old oak tree every year. And it was the way Emily's unyielding passion for protecting it had reignited something dormant in him, a spark of the boy who'd once believed in impossible, magical things. As he stood there, the immense weight of his carefully constructed plans began to shift, to groan under the pressure of this newfound clarity. What if progress wasn't about building over the past? What if it was about carefully, respectfully, weaving the old into the new? The idea was as terrifying as it was thrilling, a tightrope walk between the man he had become and the boy he had left behind. That afternoon, Matthew requested a private meeting with the town council, his usual unshakable confidence tempered by a new, humbling uncertainty. "I've been thinking," he began, the words coming out hesitant, a tone so foreign to him that it made the council members exchange surprised glances. "What if we could find a middle ground? Preserve part of the land while still bringing in some of the economic benefits?" The room fell silent, the tension so palpable it felt like you could touch it. Emily, who had been invited to the meeting, leaned forward in her chair, her eyes locking onto his. "You're actually listening," she said, her voice a quiet blend of surprise and something warmer, something that made Matthew's throat tighten. "I'm trying," he admitted, and the admission felt like shedding a heavy suit of armor he'd worn for 2 decades. "But it's not easy." Emily's smile was small but genuine, reaching, her eyes for the first time in what felt like an eternity. "Nothing worth fighting forever is." As the meeting progressed, the council members peppered him with questions, some skeptical, some hopeful, but for the first time since his return, Matthew felt the possibility of a different outcome, one that didn't require winners and losers, one that could perhaps honor both of their dreams. When the sun began to set, painting the sky in strokes of amber and gold, Matthew found Emily waiting for him outside the town hall. "You surprised me today," she said, her tone light, but her eyes searching his. Matthew shrugged, though the gesture felt wholly inadequate. "Surprised myself too," he admitted. They walked in a comfortable, companionable silence toward the preserve, the path between them suddenly less fraught with tension and unspoken accusations. "You know," Emily began, her voice thoughtful, "my dad always said that true progress is about adding, not taking away." Matthew's mind raced. Her dad, the man who taught her to fish in that very creek, who'd read her stories about conservationists and dreamers. "Maybe that's what this needs to be," he said slowly, the words forming as he spoke them into existence. "An addition, not a replacement." Emily's smile was warm, inviting, a beacon. "Now you're talking." As they reached the ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches heavy with the weight of years, Matthew reached into his pocket and pulled out the heart-shaped stone. "I've been carrying this around longer than I care to admit," he said, his voice rough. With emotion, he no longer tried to hide. "Maybe it's time to let it guide me again." Emily took the stone, her fingers brushing his in the exchange. For a long moment, time stood still. The past and the present collided in a way that felt almost sacred, holy, and as the first stars began to twinkle in the twilight sky, Matthew finally realized that sometimes the most revolutionary act a person can commit is simply choosing to listen. The final town hall was a hive of activity, but now the buzzing was a blend of curiosity and cautious hope. Matthew stood at the front, his hands resting lightly on the podium. He took a deep breath. "I owe everyone an honest explanation," he began. "My name isn't Jonathan Reed, it's Matthew Stewart, and I'm the CEO of Stewart Enterprises." The room erupted. In gasps and murmurs, Emily's breath hitched. She'd known this was coming, but hearing him say it aloud felt like a dam breaking. As the noise died down, Matthew's voice gained strength. "I came to Willow Creek with one goal: to acquire land for a development. But over the past few months, I've come to realize that this town and its people mean more than I ever allowed myself to remember." His gaze swept the room and settled on Emily. "It's been humbling, painful even, but it's also been enlightening." When Mr. Thompson from the hardware store demanded to know why they should believe him now, Matthew's response was quiet but firm. "Because I'm not asking for your trust. I'm asking for a chance to prove that change can be for the better." The gravity of his words settled over the room, After the meeting, Emily found him outside. "You did it," she said, her voice a blend of relief and pride. He turned, a small smile tugging at his lips. "We did it," he corrected gently. That evening, on her porch, she asked him what happened now. His answer was as honest as it was hopeful. "We keep fighting. For the town. For each other." And as the stars emerged, Emily allowed herself to believe they could rewrite their story, one compromise at a time. Their collaboration on a new, unified plan became the town's salvation. They proposed a smaller, eco-conscious community center funded by a modest resort, with the nature preserve and the old oak tree at its heart. The plan passed with tearful applause. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of community effort, with volunteers working side by side, healing old wounds. The grand opening was a crisp autumn evening. The new community center, a blend of modern design and rustic charm, overlooked the preserved land. Inside, laughter and music filled the air. Matthew stood watching Emily move through the crowd, a leader who had found her place. When she reached him, her hand slipped into his, as if it had always belonged there. "We did it," she whispered. "No," he replied, his voice a promise against the celebration. "We're just beginning." In the months that followed, Willow Creek thrived, a living testament to the idea that progress and preservation could coexist. As they walked the new trails hand in hand, Matthew stopped at the old oak tree. He pulled out the heart-shaped stone. "I've been thinking," he said, his eyes full of a future he now wanted to share. "About us. About what we could build not just for the town, but for ourselves." Emily's fingers brushed his as she took the stone. "I'm ready," she whispered. They had found their way home, not to a place, but to each other.